So our next speaker is Vuorinen. He's a web developer and team lead at WT Group in Finland. He came all the way from Finland to speak in front of you. He has over 10 years of experience in web development, as he has been working with commercial PHP projects since 2005. He likes to take our challenging projects and loves to solve problems effectively and deliver quality code that produces real value to the customer and user. So today we have heard from many other speakers many things about Angular, and Carl is here to walk us through Angular and to show us how powerful it is and what you can do with it.
Hello. Okay, so you can hear me. So, very excited to be here today, and as you just heard, I'm Carl. I'm from Finland, and I'm on Twitter, and I work for a company called W3 Group. And well, that's all you need to know about me. But the real topic of today is AngularJS, and small disclaimer: I am not affiliated with the development of AngularJS in any way. I just I use that technology. I'm interested in it, and I have tried to study how it works and seen people struggle with it somewhat. So I decided to come up with this talk to help other developers understand how it works. And just a quick poll so that I can get a little feel how much you know about AngularJS. Please raise your hand if you have ever tried AngularJS. Okay, and again, raise your hand if you have used it in a production application at work. Okay, that's quite a few, so good to know. But there's also a lot of people who haven't used it, so I'll try to keep a nice balance so everybody can follow along and get something out of it. The first thing when you go to the AngularJS website is you see this kind of example. And I remember the first time when I saw it, it seems like, a really cool thing. You just have some curly brace thing there and an attribute on an input field, and suddenly when you type in, it magically appears here. It felt so kind of magical. So really cool thing, and something that I was excited to use and learn more about. And here we have a second example from the AngularJS website. I have simplified it a little bit and to better fit it in this slide. And there's a lot of things happening here. And basically, it's just a small to-do application that doesn't save anything, just keeps it in memory. But it works like this. And so on, and you can also delete them. And the goal for today's presentation is that by the end of it, we will understand everything that happens in this example underneath. So let's get started. Kind of the core thing about AngularJS is the two-way data binding. Of course, that's the first thing that you see and you hear about the most. And the core of the two-way data binding is the concept called scope. And it kind of acts like a view model between your controllers and your Angular views to transfer data and also execute interactions and stuff like that. But the main thing is that there's nothing that magical about it. It's just a plain old JavaScript object if you look underneath. And the AngularJS data binding is based on a concept called dirty checking, which means that it's whenever data changes, it's considered dirty, and something needs to act on it. And to make that happen, we have concepts called watch and digest. A lot of the AngularJS internal functions and services are prefixed with the $, but since we are PHP developers, we are familiar with that kind of things. So let's look at these things. And throughout the presentation, I will have kind of like semi-pseudo code that's from the AngularJS internal, but simplified so that you can see kind of the essence of it in a more clearer kind of way. So inside the Angular scope, there's a function called watch, and basically it just takes a watch function and a listener function and push it in an array. It does nothing else. There's also, as you can see, there's this watchers array has $2 on it, and that's like the AngularJS internal functions have the $2. So when you are using the framework, you are not supposed to act on those things directly. So just the ones with the $1 prefix. And then kind of the core of the whole data binding is a thing called a digest cycle. And what it does is that it's a loop. And it does the dirty checking by executing all of the watcher functions that you can register with the watch function. And it will call each of those functions and provide the current scope to them so that they can return the value that they want to watch. And we will store that value and compare it with the last known value. And whenever they don't match, we have a dirty cycle. We mark the whole digest cycle as dirty, and then we execute the listener function so that we can act on it, and also store the new value as the last value. So whenever we have something that has changed, the cycle will be dirty, and it will run again. Whoops. It will run again and again until everything has kind of stabilized and nothing is dirty anymore. And this way, this is also quite heavily simplified from the real AngularJS internal digest cycle function. There are lots of like performance optimizations and also fail-safe mechanisms so that you don't shoot yourself on the foot so easily. Like if you ever encounter an error message that 10 digest cycles reached, that means that your scope is unstable. Something is changing all the time and it never reaches a clean state. And that's something you need to be aware of. So it usually means that you're doing something weird in your listener functions that cause more watches to be dirty again. And I'm not kidding. It was today I saw in Twitter a fellow Finnish guy posted a screenshot from a Finnish online bank that has 10 digest iterations reached error on the screen, and not even in the console, but on the screen. So it can happen. You need to understand how the digest cycle works so that you can be aware of that. And usually, when you're using the framework, you don't have to call the digest cycle yourself. It will be handled by AngularJS, other services. If you're using like a $HTTP service or $timeout and all those things, they will call digest for you, so you don't have to do it manually, usually, only if you integrate other third-party like libraries or something like that. But it's the core concept that everything else relates to, so that's why we went through this first. So any questions about that? Oh, clear what's happening? Okay, let's move on. So another thing is that the scope is not, we don't have a single scope. It's actually a hierarchy or a tree structure. There's one root scope and then a lot of child scopes for different parts of the kind of the page and different parts of the application. And for us to understand how the scope inheritance works, we need to take a little bit closer look at how JavaScript prototypical inheritance works, because it's a little bit different from normal OOP languages like PHP or whatever you are used to. So let's quickly take a look at how JavaScript prototypical inheritance works. Basically, every object in JavaScript has a prototype, and you can assign values and functions in the properties of the prototype, and then you can inherit by just assigning someone else's prototype into another class, and it will work. And you can also extend it by overriding things and stuff like that. I don't really have time to go that deeply into this topic, but if you work in the front end a lot, I really think you should invest some time to understand how this works. There's been like a great two-part article in PHP Architect magazine recently about this, and you can also look up this stuff from online and see how it works. But essentially, here's a diagram of that code that was in the last slide. We have a vehicle object here, and we have set the speed to 4, and it has a method in it. And then we have 2 other classes, or everything is kind of like an object, another class. So they all have a reference to their prototype, and it becomes a chain called a prototype chain. And the thing that we are interested in here relating to the AngularJS scopes is that whenever you access properties of an object, when you look things up, it's going to look them up down the prototype chain. The actual object is going to kind of have a shadow of that property. If it can't be found in here, it will look up the prototype chain, and then the next one, and not found here, go look all the way here. So you get the value from that one. But every time you assign values, it will assign in the current one, not down the prototype hierarchy. So, for example, in the constructor for these cars, when we set the speed to something, it will actually be set in these instances. And when you access these, it will give that one directly and not have to go look down the chain. And this is something that Angular Scopes uses, so that here is the scopes $new function that creates child scopes. It just creates an anonymous kind of like object and sets the current scope as the prototype for the new one. So the prototype doesn't actually have to be a prototype of some other. It can be whatever object you want to put there. So it's not that strict, the inheritance, as in PHP or other like real OOP languages. You can put anything you want into the prototype. And this makes it work so that when you assign values to a scope and then later on child scopes get created, you can access those values from the parent scopes through the prototype chain. Let's look at this through a small example. Here we have a few checkboxes and a few images that we want to show when the checkbox is checked. So first one, we have ng model here to a thing called show, and ng if show, then we will reveal some image and another checkbox. And then same thing for the second one, we have ng model, and then ng if we want to show another image, but it doesn't work. And that's because some AngularJS directives automatically create child scopes. And in here, we actually have 3 scopes in play. There's one like outer scope, and then the ng if here creates another child scope inside this one, and then another child scope inside this one. So we actually, what we have is this. We have the parent scope that has the show property. Then we have the first ngIf. There we have the checkbox that sets the show more to true. But then for the second ngIf, there's another child scope, and it doesn't see that value. So let's fix it. All we have to do is add a dot in all of them. Run it again, and now more money. And the reason this works now, because we didn't change any code except we added a dot in the attribute. So now with the dot, the first part is an object. It's not a, and this one is a property in that object. So if we look at it, we don't have this anymore, but instead we have this. As I said before, every time you do a lookup, it will look down the prototype chain. And when we have a dot inside there, it will first have to look up what's left of the dot before it can assign what's right of the dot. So now, when we assign the first show property, it will create us an anonymous object in the property called VM and set the show to true. And then all that the child scope inherits is the reference to the VM. And then inside that ngIf, we are first doing a lookup on VM. We don't have it, so we look up the parent, and then we find it, and then the value is here. So that's kind of like the reason the Miško Hivory, creator of AngularJS, has this quote: whenever you use ng model, there's got to be a dot in there somewhere. If you don't have a dot, you're doing it wrong. Okay, and in AngularJS 1.3, there are actually a new thing called controller as syntax that kind of, I think part of it has to do with helping developers with this problem by eliminating the need for actually having the scope object in the controller, but instead what it does, it takes the whole controller object and binds it in the scope under this property. So then if you use this, every time you will be forced to have the dot in there because it's everything you want to bind to is inside that controller object. So that kind of helps you if you do it that way, so you don't have to remember to add the dot. And there's kind of convention going on to name it as a VM, short for view model, and then use the same thing in the controller, so you can easily search for example, vm.say-hello, you can see it corresponds to this one in the controller. Makes easier to see what parts of your controller and view are working together. And also, this kind of moves you a little bit more toward AngularJS 2, because in AngularJS 2, there's no more scope. It's more similar to like binding properties straight into the controller. So I think if you are using AngularJS, this is something you should look into. Okay, next we'll talk about expressions. AngularJS has support for all kinds of expressions. You might be familiar with these kind of things from another languages like Twig for templating, or even Symfony has its own expression language that you can use in annotations and stuff like that, so it's similar. You can do all kinds of JavaScript or things like call functions, assign values, do basic arithmetics, and you have filters, which is kind of like the only thing that's besides the normal JavaScript. And for this, AngularJS has a service called $parse. And, well, it's kind of like eval within a given scope, but it's really not, because that would not be very secure. And so it's kind of like its own mini language with a lexer that tokenizes the string and the parser that creates the function that's executable and stuff like that. So it's really complicated, but usually you don't have to use that yourself. So, or even if you if you want to use $parse, you can use it yourself if you have an application where you want to kind of parse expressions. Let's take a quick example how you could use it yourself. Here is we're going to build a small spreadsheet application. Like we have a table with some rows and columns and cells here. Each cell has an input element and an output element, and then there's some little CSS trick that kind of puts them on top of each other, but so that the output is in front, but the clicks go through it to the bottom one, and when the input in the bottom has focus, we hide the output, so we actually can type in the field. And then we have a little bit of AngularJS code here in a controller. We use a parse service here to parse the expressions. And what we get out is something like this. Small spreadsheet example in few lines of AngularJS code. And because we are using the $parse service, we can use anything that AngularJS supports already. So you can like add functions and whatever, use filters and lots of things you can do. Okay, next interpolation. So when you use those expressions, you have this curly brace syntax, and what AngularJS does, it goes through the DOM nodes, find those. It uses the parse service to create the expression functions, and what it does, it adds a watch to the scope, and then in the listener function, it updates the DOM node text. So that's how the two-way data binding or the interpolation for those works, and it's not just DOM text node, also for attributes. And next, quickly go over directives. Directives are kind of like AngularJS's take on web components. They allow you to create reusable components and that can be configured from the outside and be self-contained and stuff like that. You can use them to build just little things or enhance existing elements, or you can use them to build even like whole features like a calendar, for example, or stuff like that. So they're very versatile, and they're very huge topics, so we don't have time to go that deep into what you can do with them. But if you're serious about AngularJS development, this is something you really need to know. So here's a quick example of a kind of like a button directive. This configuration of the directive, it's one of the things that Angular is criticized quite a lot because it's a little bit complicated, and yeah, it is. Even I have to go to the documentation every now and then to actually see how it works. But once you know what you can do with it, you can always look up and Google and stuff like that and make things work. So now, if we want to run this, we get a nice button that we can also customize from the outside so that it's more reusable. And the way AngularJS handles this is it walks down the DOM and it will look for all of the directives that it knows about, and it will compile them and replace the inside of that with the template and all the way down. And this is also the part that where it handles the interpolation, so that it actually will create a kind of like on-the-fly directive or anonymous directive, if you will, where it just creates a watch that updates that current elements inner HTML, for example, in this case. And then it will come back up with linking those. We will not have time to go any deeper into what actually happens there, but you just need to know that that's how it works. And then there's also a concept called transclusion. It's a weird word, and what it basically means that you can just put content in your directive and then use it in the template. So you can take that part, use it again here. And let's take a quick look about a few of those Angular internal directives. We have seen in the to-do example, for example, ng-init. That's all that it does. It takes an expression and immediately executes it in the current scope. Then we have ng-click. It's quite similar. Takes an expression, parses it, but then waits for the click event, and then it will execute it. And also, the $apply is for triggering the digest cycle, so you don't have to worry about it. Every time you click something, the digest cycle will get executed. Then we have ng-repeat. That's a lot of code, so I couldn't fit it in the slide, so I just put kind of like the basic in here. It takes an input pattern that's complicated. Always have to go look that syntax for that up from the documentation. But basically, it takes one part of it is an expression for the collection that you want to repeat. It will parse that expression, create a watch on it, and inside that listener function, this is the listener function on the watch, it will loop over the elements and keep track of the elements it has rendered and remove them and insert new ones accordingly. So that's how ng-repeat works. And then we have something like ng-model. That's also a lot of code, but the core of it is kind of listen on some events like key up in case of text input, and then trigger digest cycle and update the scope value. And for it to be a two-way binding, it also adds a watch so that it can update the value if something else changes it from the outside. Okay, quick look on performance. Don't have much time left, but we are closing in on the final things. There's AngularJS has been criticized a lot about performance, and a lot of it is valid. But as a developer, you are more equipped to write proper AngularJS applications once you understand how it works. So you know what to watch out for. Sometimes I hear people say that you shouldn't put that much data on a scope, but that doesn't really matter, because as we have seen, scope is just a plain old JavaScript object. If you put data in it, it's the same as if you keep it in some other variable. It doesn't matter. But the thing you have to keep an eye out for is the number of watches you have and the frequency that your application is running the digest cycles, because those things can really add up to make your applications slow. Just a quick thing to show you that I once wrote a Game of Life implementation using AngularJS, and it has 1,500 cells. And as you can see, it can handle quite a lot. So usually, it's not going to be that big of a problem for you. I just modified AngularJS a little bit so that it has a counter for watches and digest cycles. Had to use jQuery to update that on the page, because if I would bind to a value, it would create infinite digest cycles. So, yeah. And other thing is that you should never call functions that do resource-extensive or time-consuming operations from watched expressions, because remember, those get executed on each digest cycle. So something like this would be really bad, because now it has to execute this on every key press in this input, as well as when everything outside that triggers a digest cycle. So what you would want to do is assign the value and then have the expression just display that value. And even better, you can use like a specific button that triggers the computation, or if you don't want to add the button, you can just use like ng model options that can delay the computation to like when user hasn't typed anything for a second, for example. So with these kind of things, you can, if you are aware of what you are doing, these are kind of things you can do to make your AngularJS application more performant. And OK, let's quickly look at the original example again. This is it. When we run it, we have this expression here, ng init. It will execute immediately, and in the scope, we will have an empty list. Then we have a watch here for this expression, and it will be empty. So ng repeat will remove the list item element. Then we have a watch here for the input field. And when we type something here, it will update the model. And when I press the Enter key, this expression will be executed, so it pushes the value into the list and then empties it, so the input field will be empty again. And then this watch expression here will get notified that now we have a list that's not empty anymore, so it will transclude this list element here and put the value in the scope for that current element. And when we click here, it will execute that expression that removes the element from the list, and then again this watch expression will be notified that now the list has changed again, and it removes the element from the DOM. Any questions? OK, well, quickly, there's a book by a fellow Finnish man called by Tero Parviainen. It's called Build Your Own AngularJS. In that book, he will kind of like write AngularJS from the ground up, just using Lodash as a helper, and it's really great book, and I've been reading it and writing my own version of AngularJS. Not finished it yet, but you should check it out if you're interested to learn really, really deeply how AngularJS works. And also, Angular 2 is coming. Well, it's going to be different, yeah, but there's still going to be lots of similar things. And, well, we don't know yet how it's going to happen and when it's going to come out, but it's going to be soon. And but the way that Angular 1 is so popular right now, I think many people will have to work with, or get to work with AngularJS 1 applications for quite some time in the future. So it still pays off to know your way around it. OK.
Hi, I have a question regarding Angular 2.0. In your company, have you given any thought to migrating to 2.0 once it is released? And do you have any migration path in mind? But I know it's a tricky question because they still haven't released it. But do you know whether you're going to be, whether you would like to do it step by step, or maybe rewrite the whole application from scratch, start from scratch?
Well, first of all, of course, it depends on the application. But the biggest application I'm working on currently in my company, it's not going to be feasible to write it all from scratch again. So hopefully there will be, and I have been hearing about that there will be a migration path where you can use like kind of a router that works with both AngularJS 1 code and AngularJS 2 code at the same time. So you don't have to write everything in either or, but you can use them simultaneously. So I think it's something that even Google is aware, and if they want to keep users happy, they will have to come up with something that helps with the migration. So I'm hopeful that there will be something that helps it. Yeah, good question. I'm really eager to kind of like find out the answer by myself, but I have tried a little bit AngularJS 2, but not too much yet. So, yeah.
So I have another question because I tackled with the thing passing backend data, a lot of backend data to the Angular, because my background is from Backbone.js, and in Backbone.js we have a collection. And for example, if you have some kind of array in the PHP, you can JSON encode it and pass it to that collection. And the view class is going to work perfectly fine with that collection. But in Backbone, in Angular, I found that passing a lot of backend data to the Angular is not quite looking good. I found that the options were ng-init or passing some kind of data attributes. And what is the best way of passing a large amount of backend data to the Angular for you?
Do you mean like passing data with the request instead of doing a separate AJAX call?
Yeah, for example, I have a controller, PHP controller in action. And when the request hit detection, I have the data, I have the needed data.
Yeah.
And I don't need to make additional AJAX requests for that data.
Okay,
because I already have it.
Yeah.
So the thing is, what's the best way to pass it to the Angular?
Okay, well, one option is to use ng-init. If just put an attribute and you get the data in a scope. Of course, if you have lots of data, it's
looking kind of ugly.
Yeah, it is. So I think in that case, just put it in normal, like some
global variable, I think.
Or just put a property in the window object or something like that, and then you can access it inside your controller.
And one more thing, did you tackle with some kind of tools like PJAX? Because I'm also a Rails developer, and in Rails we have turbolinks that is also identical as PJAX. And the idea of the tool is that it loads, it doesn't make reload on your page. It just loads the contents of the page with JavaScript. And that gives me a lot of headaches with Angular.
Okay, I haven't worked with that, so sorry, I can't help you with that. But yeah, I have heard about that being a problem. So,
thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. So sorry if I'm going to ask a stupid question. I'm quite new at Angular, but in terms of performance, you mentioned that we have to look at a number of watchers and number of iterations. How do we do that? I mean, is there any kind of a tools or?
Well, yeah. One thing is of course, like as I mentioned in this slide, you have to think about when you execute those expressions and like kind of like move your code to a place that so that you don't execute on each digest cycle. And a new feature came in, I think it was Angular 1.4, that allows you to create one-time bindings. So, for example, in here, we don't really have any place to update this once a to-do item is added to the list. So we don't really need a watch here, because nothing will update that value ever. So what you can do is you can, okay, that's not edit. What happened? What did I do? Never seen that one before. What you can do is you can create one-time bindings by adding 2 colons inside the brackets, and that creates a one-time binding. So that kind of like helps you reduce the amount of watches you have. For example, if you have a lot of data coming in from the backend, you list it in like a table or with columns and cells and stuff like that. There's going to be a lot of data, and you want to. It's dynamic data that comes from the backend, but if your application doesn't have any way to modify it right now, you don't really need the watch. So then you can use this syntax to reduce the number of watches you have. And also for something like if you use translations, you just have a filter for translating strings. You really only want to do that once, so you can use that syntax. So those are kind of few little things you can do.
I'm sure you guys have other questions, but the closing keynote starts in about 5 minutes. So you can all go there, but before that, let's give Carl another round of applause.
Okay. Yeah, slides will be up here in a few minutes, and I would appreciate some feedback. So.